Good afternoon, or good mid-morning. We're going to begin with the panel so we get as much information imparted. The title of this panel is Rising to the Challenge of Copenhagen. As those of you who follow this issue know, on December 7th, we'll be meeting in Copenhagen to advance the Kyoto agenda to the next stage. We've got a terrific panel this morning. To my left is Jeroen van der Veer, the Chief Executive of Royal Dutch Shell. Next to him is Prime Minister Rasmussen from Denmark, Vice President Al Gore, Jacques Aigrain, the Chief Executive Officer of Swiss Re, and Ivo de Boer, the Executive Secretary of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. I'm going to begin by asking one question to all our panelists, ask them to take 3 or 4 minutes to each answer. It's a very simple question. What has to happen between now and December 7th, when Copenhagen opens, to ensure that the conference is a success? And I'd like to begin with Prime Minister Rasmussen, who will have the honor, the privilege, and the pressure of making sure that Copenhagen is a success. Prime Minister.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. First of all, I think it's essential to engage heads of state and government stronger in the whole process to ensure a positive result in Copenhagen. But let me start by speaking about December. What are we going to achieve? And I think 3 points are important. Firstly, we have to agree on targets. Secondly, we have to agree on funds. And thirdly, we have to agree on verification. My point of departure is the International Climate Panel and their recommendations. Therefore, I think we should agree on a long-term goal to reduce the emissions by 50% in 2050, based on the principle of common but differentiated responsibility. That is, the industrialized countries must take the lead. I think industrialized countries should commit themselves to reduce emissions by 80% by 2050, and also commit themselves to an intermediate goal by 2020. We should, in the industrialized world, reduce emissions by 30% in 2020. But we also need engagement from the developing countries. I think the developing countries should commit themselves to reduce emissions by 15 to 30% in 2020 compared to a business-as-usual scenario. So far the targets. We also need to fund our endeavors to disseminate green technology, to finance the development of a low-carbon society, and we have to assist developing countries in their endeavors to adapt to climate change. To that end, we need a global fund. We need to generate revenue for that fund. The revenue could be generated by the auctioning of CO2 quotas, emission permissions, and we could provide funds for developing countries, merit-based, that is, according to their commitment to reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. And finally, we have to verify all this. If we are to get acceptance of this scheme, we need a transparent and reliable scheme where we can measure, report and verify that all these commitments are really fulfilled. So, how do we get there? I think we need a process, a high-level process, engaging heads of state and government. And I think it should get started, the sooner the better. I would very much like to see a high-level meeting among a number of major players at the level of heads of state and government in March, for instance, followed by the G8 summit meeting in July. And then we have already prepared a UN high-level meeting in September. These 3 high-level meetings could be the stepping stones towards Copenhagen. Maybe we should also engage ministers of finance to ensure that we all realize that there is actually no contradiction between an ambitious climate policy and our endeavors to overcome the financial crisis. On the contrary, the policies we need to overcome the financial crisis are the very same policies that should be used to combat climate change. We need a green, sustainable growth, and to that end, we need to engage the private sector and also ministers of finance.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Vice President Gore, I'd like you to answer the same question, and if you'd also give us a sense of how the new administration in Washington maybe creates even newer and more far-reaching possibilities for Copenhagen.
Yesterday, the United States House of Representatives passed an $820 billion stimulus bill, the largest component of which is a green stimulus. I think it's important for the world leaders in business and government gathered here to fully appreciate the magnitude of the change in U.S. leadership. The United States is now prepared, under President Obama's leadership, to re-engage the world community in an urgent response to the climate crisis and to make the solutions to the economic crisis the same as the solutions to the climate crisis. We have a credit crisis and a synchronized global recession. To draw a brief analogy, the detonator of the climate crisis was the sudden realization that subprime mortgages, based on the assumption that you could make a lot of mortgages with people who could not repay them, but wash away the risk by securitizing those subprime mortgages and selling them into the global marketplace. That assumption suddenly collapsed, creating a crisis of confidence in credit markets. The most powerful thing we've heard is an idea whose time has come. Maybe the second most powerful thing is an assumption that suddenly collapses. By analogy, we have a $6 trillion market in subprime carbon investments, whose value is based on the assumption that it's perfectly all right to dump 70 million tons of global warming pollution into the thin shell of atmosphere surrounding the planet every 24 hours. That it's perfectly all right to put 25 million tons of that CO2 every day into the world's oceans. The oceans are being choked off of oxygen. They're dying as a result of this process. And we're now seeing right before our eyes the melting of the entire North Polar ice cap, the size of China, the size of the continental United States. It's been there for most of the last 3 million years. We're now seeing, according to reports just this past week, the beginning of serious melting in Antarctica, and the whole list of other consequences. So the assumption that we can continue on this path is an assumption that is collapsing. So the question is where we go from here. And the Obama administration is saying that in the United States we have to quickly build a unified national smart grid that has two features. It can transport with high efficiency clean electrons from the sun-drenched centers of the southwestern United States to the cities where electricity is used, from the wind corridor of our mountain states to the places where electricity is used. And that smart grid can be outfitted with smart features that empower conservation and efficiency to sharply reduce CO2 in buildings, in structures, and the rest. This is being accompanied by a sharp move toward the electrification of the auto fleet, which will give us the capacity to solve the battery problem. Instead of just looking at improvements in the technology of batteries in a single place, rather to create a widely distributed battery so that all of those vehicles, when they're not in use, can feed electricity back into the grid. When the Internet was first begun, it linked supercomputing centers where the capacities were illustrated and then it shifted to a widely distributed information processing environment with small devices that most people here carry around in their pockets now. The future of renewable energy will also eventually be widely distributed, but the first stages will be with concentrating solar electric plants, photovoltaic plants that will intersect with solar thermal midway through this decade, geothermal and wind, and other new breakthroughs that are slightly farther off. What we most need out of Copenhagen is a clear, shared vision of the direction the world is going to take in the future. For a variety of reasons, I think that future is likely not to be dominated by a large-scale ramp-up of nuclear plants. We can debate that. I think it'll play a slightly larger role, but not a huge additional role. I doubt that in the near-term or mid-term carbon capture and sequestration will be the future. I think we have to decide to put a price on carbon so that markets can make intelligent decisions about the allocation of capital to the most efficient production of clean electrons and the most efficient reduction in waste of energy. And the early stages of a movement toward a 350 parts per million goal, which is, I think, where we're going to have to end up, are the same as the early stages of a move toward 450 or some larger target. Once the center of gravity shifts, once we move toward a clear shared vision of a renewable energy, low carbon future, then you're going to see large flows of investment that create a self-fulfilling prophecy. To conclude, again to the internet analogy, Moore's law emerged over a 40-year period. And it's not a law of physics. It is a law of R&D spending based on the assumption that others are going to meet a target of 50% cost reductions every 18 months. That same phenomena can and will emerge with the R&D flows into renewable energy, conservation, and efficiency.
Just a very quick follow-up. We certainly know President Obama is different from President Bush on this issue in so many respects. But how would you summarize it?
My friends in the new administration say to a person that when the new administration gathers to discuss these options, the greenest person in the room is President Obama. He is pushing hard for a dramatic and bold move in the right direction. If other governments around the world do the same, then we can make this turn toward a low-carbon future. We're running out of time. We have overshot the target. We are already above. We have 386 parts per million in the atmosphere today. Greenland and West Antarctica have the potential to each raise sea level by 20 feet. The third largest mass of ice in the Himalayas is threatening the 50% of the fresh water supply for 1.4 billion people in the world. We're seeing the same thing on the western side of the Andes, to the western side of the Rockies, and in all other glaciated mountain ranges in the world. The new administration is very serious about this. I believe, forgive my pride as an American, I believe the United States retains the capacity to provide leadership for the world. I greatly appreciate Prime Minister Rasmussen's leadership and Connie Hedegaard, who is here, and his whole team. The one thing I think is most important that ought to come out of this session is don't get the impression that Copenhagen is just a way station to some other meeting next year or the following year. We need an agreement this year, not next year, this year. We're running out of time. One other point. In response to the synchronized global recession, it's abundantly obvious that we need a synchronized global stimulus. And if we can develop a shared vision of the direction in which the world must move, then other countries like the United States can make the majority of that stimulus to get the economy going again a green stimulus that moves us toward an historic generational commitment to a one-off investment that switches the world's energy infrastructure from one that's based not on Russian gas or Middle East oil, not on carbon fuels that are expensive, that are colliding with rising demand as new discoveries fall off, but toward a source of fuel that's free forever, the sun and the wind.
Thanks so much. Jacques, from your point of view, particularly from the insurance industry point of view, what do we have to do between now and Copenhagen to make this meeting a success?
Well, let me maybe slightly modify your question. I think that the Prime Minister and the Vice President have set the scene. The facts, I think, are quite clear. Let me just touch on the expectation from a private sector perspective, the hope, and then one challenge. The expectation is we need the targets which are fitting the scientific facts, and there I think that the Prime Minister has expressed it very clearly. The second thing is we are in a world where 80 to 85% of any investment is actually done by the private sector. And we need thus a framework. The key point from a private sector perspective is Copenhagen can provide a sustainable, long-term framework with a reasonable degree of participation by all the major countries. The hope, obviously I'm a biased capitalist. I strongly believe that if the framework is set with a reasonable market mechanism or even taxation mechanism, but a fair level playing field from that standpoint, the market economy will adjust. They may prefer one solution than another, but whatever the solution, if it is well defined, investment will go where it makes economic sense, and the goals will be achieved in a self-funded mechanism by the industry itself and by the participants, i.e. all of us. The challenge is we speak, as mentioned by the Prime Minister, of an adaptation fund with regards to helping the weaker emerging countries in their efforts for CO2 adaptations. But between now and then, the inertia in the system will continue to cause for the next decades actually an increase in the deteriorations of the climate vagaries of the sea level, etc., mentioned by the Vice President. It looks to us, particularly from an insurance perspective actually, that it is critical to find a solution to mitigate the short-term effects, meaning the next short-term in those sense, 10 years, 15 years, of the population at risk in the coastal areas, particularly across the world. And there it's a challenge because the amounts of money at stake are big, and the notion of funding through a CO2 tax, CO2 trading tax, doesn't seem to quite match. We can speak probably of $500 million of revenue on one side versus $50 billion of investment on the other side. That part is a challenge.
Is it terrifying to be in the insurance business in the age of climate change?
Now, to a certain extent,
just occurred to me.
Fair question. Any insurance is there to absorb volatility and uncertainty. That makes other risk-taking opportunities possible. So we are there to challenge those, but we strongly believe indeed that mitigations, building codes, zonings are a critical element as well. That's mitigation. For the poorer country, it has to be done slightly differently.
Jeroen, is it terrifying to be in the oil business in the age of Copenhagen? I mean, is it...
Change in the environment means that you have new opportunities to do business for your company. Let me first say I can talk here on behalf of what is the viewpoint of Shell, but I head up in the European Round Table, the Energy and Climate Change Group, which are the 50 largest companies, industrial companies of Europe. Now, to get an aligned viewpoint between 50 companies, I think the English expression is called herding cats. I think in Dutch we have a better expression is you try to push a wheelbarrow and every company is a frog. So you have to push a wheelbarrow with 50 frogs in it and they jump all the time out of it. but so far we have a shared vision between the 50 companies and I hope that when Copenhagen starts and finishes that we have still that same shared vision. We have even gone further. We have now liaised with the American Round Table to see whether they can align to that kind of thinking that has taken place over the past year. So I think here this is a very positive development that the European industry tries to speak more or less with one voice in Copenhagen. Now what are the key points? And that is as follows. We think it should all start, and that is very much in line with the previous speakers, set a target for 2050. 2050 you have, and there is a ceiling on the man-made number of tons of CO2 into the atmosphere. And then you make milestones when you go along, or evaluation points. 2010, 2020, 2030, 2040, whatever you decide. So it is not, and now we do something and we hope we come out okay. So a target and milestones on the road. Then the long-term international framework. I completely agree with Jacques. That's what you need. What is the basis of that international framework? So if you look in the contents into it. First of all, you have to price CO2. You will come nowhere if there is no price of CO2. So if you save CO2, you should have a reward for it. Or if you like to bring CO2 in the atmosphere, there should be a penalty. There must be a price for CO2. There are many ways to do that. As industry in Europe, we think one of the good systems is what we call an energy trading system. Because that can price CO2. That can coexist next to carbon taxes, or it can coexist to, as in Europe, we have taxes on gasoline. But we think an emission trading system is the first thing you should have. Then you have the overall target, but there should be sub-targets for the developed countries. And that, of course, should fit into the overall target. We think that the developing countries, that's the third point, they should come in via sector agreements. What is a sector agreement is that all the steel industry in the world has certain targets. How do you do that? And you can work them even them within the trading systems, or the base chemical industry, or refineries, or what have you. The fourth point is that we think that carbon capture and storage is an interesting technology. But so far, not any real large project is built in the world. There are many plans. But and we have to see whether it really works and is doing the job. Why are we enthusiastic about carbon capture and storage? Because it has the potential to be big. It can make a dent into the problem of CO2. That's what we think. And you can see it potentially as a bridge to, let's say, a real renewables longer-term future as well. The fifth one is the whole subject of biofuels. Now, you know the competition with food, fresh water, etc. In the end, you must have an understanding what are sustainable biofuels, and that has probably to do with certification for sourcing and other measures, and that we have a common view what sustainable biofuels are. And the seventh, mentioned already before, energy savings has still a huge scope, and it is very helpful if you have preferably coordinated international standards, standards for buildings, standards for vehicle efficiency. So on the way to Copenhagen, Tom, these are the points I will do strong advocacy, and I hope that not only other companies but others will help me with that.
Thank you. Ivo, I wonder if you'd answer the question, what has to happen between now and Copenhagen, but speak also on behalf of, because we have a limited panel, China, India. Give us a sense of what you think their perspective is as well.
Thank you. I thought it was very interesting what Jeroen had to say about the 50 frogs in his wheelbarrow. I'm trying to get 192 countries to Copenhagen, so maybe he's got some good tips for me. I think we actually already have a shared vision. And it was brought to us by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and signed up to by all of the countries of the world. And what that shared vision basically indicates, as Al Gore said, that is, we have to get it right in Copenhagen. There's no second chance here. I would very much agree with Prime Minister Rasmussen that clarity on commitments and clarity on finance are going to be absolutely critical to getting to that result in Copenhagen. But I would like to add a third imperative, and it gets to your point. I think we also need to look at global governance, because quite honestly, we are asking major economic powers like China, India, Brazil to engage fully in this solution, and they have to. But at the same time, most places where decisions are being taken, those countries are either temporary members or they fall into the plus category. And I just don't believe that is a fair reflection of today's realities. I think we have an inclination to forget that the 1992 Framework Convention on Climate Change actually already obliges all countries of the world to take action to limit their emissions. But for developing countries, that commitment is conditional on the provision of financial support, technological support, and capacity building. And that is where finance is so critical in coming to a solution. But finance flows from ambition. If we can put a global response in place, if we can agree to ambitious commitments broadly in Copenhagen, then the market effort to achieve those commitments in a cost-effective way will go a long way to helping us generate the resources that we need to make four pieces of the puzzle come together. And those four pieces are ambitious targets from industrialized countries, engagement from major developing nations, significant finance to get the process moving, and a governance structure that reflects the realities of today, not 1948.
It's clear, just listening to you all, that this is going to be a real challenge, particularly in the economic environment we're in right now. So I want to go back quickly through the panel, and I want you to each tell me the one thing, the absolute one thing you believe has to come out of Copenhagen for us to feel that it was a success. I mean, there will be many things you'll want, and many things will come out, but what is that one thing that better come out of this meeting, otherwise it won't be a success? Again, Prime Minister, if you'd start us off, since you're going to have to host this.
Well, it's a very difficult question to just point to one thing, but if I'm forced to, I would say
I'm going to force.
The essential thing is to agree on clear targets, because the clear targets, or I would say a fixed framework, is a prerequisite for creating a private market. Mm-hmm. We have to put a price on carbon.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good.
Other panelists have said that. I fully agree. We have to put a price on carbon, and to that end, we need to create a market, and therefore we need clear targets. So I would point to that.
So your answer
would be
the
important thing.
That we have to set in place, in stone, the basic foundations of a market that will trigger that kind of private sector investment and response.
Exactly.
Okay. Al, what would you say? If you just get one, what would it be? No.
I think developing countries really hold the key to the success at Copenhagen. It will be difficult for them to accept differentiated but binding obligations in the first phase. If they decided not to do that, then the degree of political difficulty in the developed countries would rise from an already high level. Mm-hmm. If they do, then I think we'll get an agreement, and we have to get an agreement. But in order to induce them to agree, the developed countries have to follow through on an adaptation fund and technology sharing that allows them to cope with the damage they're already having to deal with, and to open up a pathway for them to adopt the new renewable technologies. Just as many of them leapfrogged the old fixed-line telephone service and went straight to cell phones, so they can leapfrog the old dirty coal-fired generating plants and go to widely distributed photovoltaics, solar and wind.
So what would that look like then as a decision? What would that headline be? Copenhagen decided this week what? That would trigger that.
A global agreement to sharply reduce CO2 emissions.
That brings in both the developed and developing countries in one framework. Mm-hmm. Jacques, what would you say?
I would not change a word of what the Prime Minister just mentioned. Mm-hmm. Framework and a price on CO2, which allows then the market economy to actually adapt. The one supplementary comment I would make, from a macroeconomic perspective, I'm always a little bit surprised by the idea that everything is a new expense rather than looking at it as a positive capital expenditure. And it goes a little bit to the Vice President's last remarks about what is the leapfrogging in the emerging markets of the mobile phones versus fixed lines. Mm-hmm. The same can happen indeed, and we don't have a lack of capital expenditure potential, and even in the midst of an economic crisis, I joined the Vice President, it can be a very good part of the Keynesian part of the macroeconomic programs that most of our countries are trying to have.
Jeroen, you get one prize out of Copenhagen.
I had this international framework, but I can switch now because that point is made. I think what we agree in Copenhagen, it is absolutely essential that from day one after Copenhagen, that it is clear that it has the signatures from the United States, India, China, and all the European countries.
You would agree with the Vice President then, this kind of global framework?
Yeah, but Kyoto was a global framework, but it missed some signatures.
But it did not have binding commitments from developing countries in the first phase. And one thing that's changed since Kyoto is leadership from countries like Brazil, Mexico, China, Indonesia, and an emerging willingness to accept the right kind of differentiated but still binding commitments in that first phase. And the linkage between the political capacity to adopt a Copenhagen Treaty in countries like the United States and the global nature of the commitment, even if they're differentiated commitments, if they're binding in the first phase everywhere in the world, then the ability of developed countries to get their publics to permit them to adopt this treaty, that goes way up. So I really think that's the key.
Go ahead, please. Yeah.
If I may, this is a bit of a challenge within a constructive atmosphere. I think if you think back on Kyoto and the danger for Copenhagen, if a big country is outside, then other countries may prefer to stay outside. And then you say, well, let's wait until the other countries, and then, as the Vice President just explained. What I try to say is, if the big countries come in the club, that is much more powerful to convince those countries which, for whichever reasons, are hopefully then temporarily outside the club. So that's why it is so important from day one that the very large countries, and you may include Brazil, that's very fine, and that they are in the club of the agreement, because then you can start to make speed.
Are you still dubious in some way that America will be there? That we will be? I'm asking you. That we will be there in the end?
I think what the Vice President said and the initial speeches of President Obama are, in my views, very hopeful. Mm-hmm.
Well, there's an old saying in business, if we had some ham, we could have some ham and eggs if we had some eggs. And I think by comparison, if we have the big countries agreeing to do this, we can have an agreement if we have the developing countries agreeing to do it. And the truth is we have to do both things simultaneously. There's an old African proverb that says, if you want to go quickly, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. We have to go far quickly. And that means the emergence of a new global consciousness, that we really are facing a planetary emergency that puts the developing countries even more at risk than those nations that have greater resources to adapt to the new realities. None of us can adapt to the longer term changes if we don't restrain emissions. But if you completely cut off all emissions from the United States, Japan, and Western Europe, we would still have a climate crisis because of the emerging economic activity in the rest of the world. It has to be a planetary solution to a planetary crisis.
Ivo, again, I'm interested in, if just one thing comes out of that wheelbarrow with all those frogs you're going to have to shepherd there, what would it be? And I'm also interested in your frank assessment of, we know what America, China need to do. Do you think they're really ready to do that?
Well, I think that to talk about people that are in a club and doing something, and therefore people that are outside a club and apparently doing nothing, is not a very constructive way to get to a good conversation in Copenhagen. I think that China, India, Brazil, Mexico, South Africa, I mean, I can go on for a long time mentioning countries that have ambitious climate change strategies in place already. For China, that means 20% industrial energy efficiency improvement. And we're talking about the largest investor worldwide with Germany in renewable sources of energy. So I think different countries, according to their capabilities, are doing their best, but they need help. Which gets me to my critical point for Copenhagen, and that is significant and stable and predictable financing for developing countries to limit their emissions and adapt to the impacts of climate change. And I mention that one because if we get the stable and predictable finance, something else will have happened. What will have happened is that industrialized countries will have committed to ambitious targets that generate the resources for international cooperation. So industrialized country commitment will help to generate an important part of the resources, and those resources will then make it possible for developing countries to go the extra green mile that is beyond the parameters of their economic reality.
You know, one of my tutors on this subject, Rob Watson, who was the guy who really spearheaded green buildings for NRDC, Rob has a saying that I always liked, and it's that, Mother Nature, she's just chemistry, biology, and physics. That's all she is. You can't spin her, you can't sweet talk her, you can't talk her up, you can't talk her down. You can't say, Mother Nature, we're having a financial crisis. Could you take the year off? She's just going to do what she's going to do, and to put it in American baseball terms, Mother Nature always bats last, and she always bats 1,000. So she's going to do what she's going to do, yet we are in this economic crisis, all of you in your own way, having to wrestle with it. How is it naive to think that the economic crisis could actually create possibilities that would make Copenhagen, that would raise the prospects of success there? Or are we really in an illusion that if you look at the agenda in America today for President Obama, it's very clear. I mean, for him, the top three issues are banks, banks, and banks. Prime Minister.
I think that's the crucial question. It's encouraging to listen to President Obama. However, we have to realize that the main obstacle during 2009 on the road to Copenhagen may be the financial crisis. Therefore, one of our major tasks will be to offer examples that climate policies are actually also sound economics. Let me offer you three brief examples. Firstly, if oil consumption in the United States were reduced to the same level per capita as in Denmark, oil imports in the United States could be reduced equivalent to 80%. With the current oil price, it's equivalent to $180 billion a year. A dollar saved is a dollar gained, which could be spent on job creation in other sectors and the creation of green jobs. It's sound economics to increase energy efficiency. China is another example. It's estimated that until 2030, the number of cars in China will increase 3 times or something like that. If the car fleet in China were transferred into a green fleet, electric cars, oil imports in China could be reduced equivalent to 80%. It's equivalent to $250 billion a year, which could be spent on green job creation in other sectors. And my third example, my own country, in a smaller scale, I admit that, but we have developed a strong green energy sector in Denmark, created 30,000 jobs in the energy sector. Today, exports of green energy technologies constitute around 10% of our exports. Renewable energy sources, or out of the total energy consumption, renewable energy represents 19%, and still Denmark is a welfare society, a strongly competitive society. During the last 25 years, our economy has grown by 80%, and during the same period of time we have seen a nearly stable energy consumption. So 0 growth in energy consumption, 80% economic growth. So it is actually possible to pursue ambitious climate policies and at the same time stimulate green growth.
Oh, what would you say to that question?
What's the question again?
That
the crisis, economic crisis can be an opportunity.
Can we?
Well, yeah, absolutely. 15 years ago, no one had ever heard of the Internet or the World Wide Web. Now it's $1 trillion economy. And look at the expansion of jobs and investment that's come from something that didn't exist 15 years ago. The greatest source of new employment opportunities, new investments, new profits is going to be the shift to a low-carbon economy. There's no question about it. Now, in response to this global economic crisis, monetary policy is of limited value today because interest rates, and well, I'll speak as an American, interest rates are nearly 0, so there are not many bullets left in that in monetary policy. So we've seen the world turning back to a Keynesian stimulus because it's obviously the right way to go. And within stimulus spending packages, infrastructure, you have to do unemployment compensation and all of those because people spend that money. But investments in infrastructure should be made in a way that accomplish this transition to a new renewables infrastructure.
Let me just ask one point on that, because you and I be preaching to the converted. But why does the party of business in America, the Republican Party, not seem to, certainly universally, there is change going on there. Why is it still such a hard sell with them now? The party of business.
Well, I think there are a couple of reasons. I think that there has been, on the right of the political spectrum in the U.S., a kind of Three Musketeers philosophy, one for all and all for one. And the collection of constituencies that make up that coalition has included carbon-intensive companies that, until very recently, were digging in their heels and shamefully financing deniers and trying to interrupt the formation of political consensus that reality is reality. But I think they are shifting now. Now, Royal Dutch Shell, even before Kyoto, acknowledged the science, provided leadership in saying we have to recognize this. That was not the case in the United States. I think the second part of the answer is that there has been a philosophical fear that the transition to a low-carbon economy would be accompanied by an increase in statism and a larger government role. And I think that there's an instinctive resistance to that, and it's understandable. But we saw in response to the credit crisis that in an emergency, the government's role expanded very dramatically. And it can be done in a right way to fix the market. You know, capitalism itself is under challenge in this crisis, and yet we all know it unlocks a higher fraction of the human potential than any other system, but we need sustainable capitalism. And we should have, of course, a large CO2 tax that is refunded to publics, that puts a price on carbon in a very efficient way. But with the exception of some Scandinavian countries and some provinces of Canada, the other political systems in the world are far from seeing an ability to do that. And so a cap-and-trade system is the next best way to put a price on carbon. And then individual nation states can choose, if they wish, to use a carbon tax as part of their way of meeting that cap.
Jacques, analysts like me, pundits, we can, advocate all this, but you've got to deliver quarterly returns. Can you really green the bailout?
Well, of course, we are a poor example to the extent that as a pure service industry, our CO2 footprint is extremely limited. And so it's very easy for us to commit to a zero CO2 emission, including by buying emission rights and other steps. But again, I think that the Prime Minister expressed it very well. I don't have very much to add in terms of the power of fundamental economics. If the rules of the games are clear, the private sector will adjust and will use the money smartly to its own self-interest, and that has been proven time and time again. You remember the questions a few decades ago, not far ago, with regards to the fluorocarbons. The world was up in arms about the fact that it would be impossible to reach the targets of moving away from the historical systems of refrigerations to the new ones. It was done by everyone, and it was done approximately 1/3 faster than the timelines which had been imparted. And it will be the same. If we have the rules, if it is market-based, and if it is the playing field is leveled, meaning that all the industries, I join Jeroen entirely, all the industries are treated in an equal fashion. You cannot just, that's a major problem for the political system. I'm perfectly conscious of it, because the lobbying of some of the part of the economy is considerably stronger than others. So it's always a temptation to say, the private use of automobile is not going to be subject, while vice versa, you are suddenly taxing some other form of public transportation, to give an obvious example, which is a bit of a contradiction.
Jeroen, you've got to deliver for your shareholders. This is not a joke for you.
Yeah, two short points. First of all, the transition of the energy system of the world, and not only that we have to transfer to the low carbon economy, but in the meantime, the world goes from between now and 2050 to 6 to 9 billion people, and they really like all to have electricity to transport themselves. This is a job which you have to work on for decades. So during the coming 40 years, I'm afraid we have to go through many crises, not only this financial crisis, there will be others. We had crises in the past, they come about every 7 years. So that is never an excuse not to start now. And I think, and I agree with the previous speakers, you can even make it like a win-win to try to attack that now. Now, how is that for a company like Shell? What I always think is that if the business environment is static and we do every day the same, probably we marginalize ourselves. We make every day a bit less profits. So the best thing is that you have a changing business environment, and the business environment has changed, will change, and we have more insights now about climate change and CO2 than 20 years ago. That is good news, because a changing business environment creates opportunity for firms. So I always say to our own people in Shell, hang on, don't be defensive about CO2. This is the best opportunity that can come for Shell, because we claim to be good in technology, we have an international mindset, we can invest in it, we happen to know something about it. And so in the end of the day, I see CO2 as an opportunity, and I don't see the financial crisis any reason to slow down.
Ivo, I want to give you the last word, both on this question of how the economics can really complicate your task, and also just maybe your last word to exhort people about Copenhagen, why it's important, and how we cannot let it fail.
Well, on your first point, the economic crisis, I'm not an economist, but I'm sort of assuming it's not going to last for 30 years. And why do I mention 30 years? Because that's how long the average power plant lasts. So if you build a power plant now, if you go for cheap and dirty, not taking the long-term issue into account, you're going to be in big trouble. And that's why I think that so many of the economic recovery packages of the United States, of Europe, of China, have a major focus on changing the direction of economic growth. And actually that's what Copenhagen is all about increasing prosperity while changing the direction of economic growth. My sense is that there is a huge public desire to advance in Copenhagen and a huge political will to advance in Copenhagen. The little challenge that Prime Minister Rasmussen faces is to reduce this incredibly complicated issue to its 4 simple political components and give us clarity on those.
Terrific. Well, this has been a great panel. I want to thank you, and I look forward to meeting a year from now, looking back on how Copenhagen came out. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Tom.